I'll read out a little bit about David in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, but I also want to thank you for taking time out of your day, whether you're listening to the live cast or whether you're listening to a postcast by way of our podcasts, our YouTube channel, or any other medium. Indeed, you may even be seeing this on television broadcast later. We've got a fascinating discussion today, which deals with the question of targeted killings and whether or not those targeted killings are a strategic asset or liability for the state of Israel. And quite frankly, we could not have more of an expert than the gentleman by whom we are joined, David Hacham. He served for 30 years in the Israel Defense Forces intelligence and retired holding the rank of colonel. He's also a former commander of coordination of government activities in the territories, a position that's full title is reduced down to the acronym COGAT, C-O-G-A-T, Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories. And David Hacham was also an advisor for Arab affairs to 7 Israeli ministers of defense. So, David, thank you so very much for joining us. We're going to run this call for about an hour and 15 minutes. And we're very much looking forward to learning from you. Before we get going, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you currently reside? Where were you born? Just a little bit of personal detail about you, if you would, David.
Okay. First of all, Benjamin, thank you for inviting me to your program. And I'll try to answer in a very short way because my biography, I can speak about it more than hours. As a matter of fact, I was born in Israel. I was born in Israel to a family. My parents came from Baghdad, from Iraq, after the independence of the state of Israel in the year 1951. And I was raised, basically, my childhood was in a little town very close to Tel Aviv called Ramat HaSharon. You know Ramat HaSharon. And later on, I moved to Ramat Gan with my family. I studied in Oel Shem High School in Ramat Gan. Later on, military service. Afterwards, university. I studied in Tel Aviv University, history of the Middle East, the Arabic language. And during my service in the army, as a matter of fact, I started in various intelligence corps of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Part of my military service at the beginning was in the Prime Minister's office, which is, let's say, a way to say Mossad. I was 4 years in the Mossad. And then I continued my military service while I came to the Gaza Strip. I was the advisor of the, let's say, the military commanders of the military administration in Gaza. And as a matter of fact, to the coordinator of the government activities, as you have said before, in the territories. I spent 8 years in the Gaza Strip. As a matter of fact, during my service in Gaza, my military service, I was the head of the Arab Affairs Department operating in Gaza, which was the eyes and ears of the military administration in the Gaza Strip area. And this is why during my service in Gaza, I got to know in a very intensive way and a direct way all the spectrum of the Palestinian leadership in the area, beginning from the far left and going on until the radical extreme Islamic organizations. This is why I knew personally almost all the leaders behind the activities of the Islamic radical movements in the Palestinian territories. In this regard, I would like only to mention maybe a few names in order to understand what my recognition of these people. First of all, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was the paralyzed guy, the disabled guy, who, as a matter of fact, formed at the beginning of the first Intifada. As a matter of fact, in order to be accurate, 5 days after the beginning, the eruption, of the First Intifada at the 9th of December 1987. That is to say, the 14th of December 87, he established Hamas, which is one of the most dramatic development took place in the Palestinian territories in the last generations. And this was, of course, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. I met with him for hundreds of times. I even published a research by Haifa University about my experience with Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. By the way, I think he was one of the most clever and wise guy I met in the Palestinian arena, Sheikh Yassin. He was annihilated. He was killed by Israel at March 22nd, 2004, in a targeted killing by the Israeli Defense Forces, 2004. By the way, the guy who came after him, Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi, which became after Sheikh Yassin, the leader of Hamas, was annihilated 3 weeks after. It didn't last for a long period of time as Hamas leader, and at the 17th of April 2004, he was annihilated by the IDF. By the way, I must tell you something very much important in this regard. When I'm saying that the IDF was behind the annihilation, the killing of Palestinian terrorists, you have to say at the same breath, it's not only the IDF, because the intelligence is from what we call in Hebrew the Shabak, the General Security Service. They are responsible for the intelligence and for the frustrating all terror activities coming from the territories, and this is their responsibility. So at the same breath, we have to mention the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Shabak. The other guy,
I'm going to interrupt you just before you carry on, because I'm going to run down these personalities with you, but I don't know if you yet told us who are the ministers of defense that you worked with. So
listen,
I'd like to have those names before we move on to
I started my mission, my activities in the Ministry of Defense in the year 1997. That period of time, it was Itzik Mordechai, the Minister of Defense, and I continued later on with the other ministers that came after Itzik Mordechai, Ehud Barak, and after Ehud Barak, beforehand, it's not Ehud Barak, it was Arens, Misha Arens, and then Ehud Barak, and then Fuad Ben Eliezer, Benjamin Ben Eliezer, and then afterwards, it was the guy who is minister now in the Israeli government, before Shaul Mofaz, and Shaul Mofaz and Yelon. All these ministers of defense, I used to be in their office. So I was the advisor for Arab Affairs to the ministers of defense, which in practical terms means, Benjamin, that I held I would say, the responsibility of having the relations with Arab leaders. And when I'm speaking about Arab leaders, first and foremost, I'm speaking about Egypt. I was, I think, in almost all the meetings of Israeli prime ministers, ministers of defense, even foreign minister, when David Levy was the Israeli foreign minister, with the late Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt. Later on, with the present president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, I saw many, many times. King Hussein of Jordan, who died in 1998, his son, King Abdullah II, and needless to say, the Palestinian leaders, beginning first of all with Chairman Yasser Arafat, Abu Ammar. I was, by the way, in the 90s, in almost all the meetings of Israeli prime ministers, ministers of defense, and even foreign minister with Chairman Arafat, including the two meetings which took place at the year 2000. I don't know if you remember, after the meetings with Arafat, Chairman Arafat, these two leaders, Barak and Arafat, came to Camp David in America in order to see whether there is a possibility to push ahead the peace process, the political negotiations with the Palestinians. But unfortunately, these negotiations were failed. And after they returned back to the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat and Barak to Israel, the second intifada was erupted, October 1999. And this was, I mean, the end of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations in the framework, of course, of the Oslo process.
So David, thank you for giving us some of the background, and I'm very pleased that you have done, because people really do need to understand the perspective and the expertise that you brought to your article. And I just want to base our conversation on that article, if I may. And it was published on the Miriam Institute website, and I'd like to encourage people to read it. The article is entitled, "Who by Cell Phone, Who by Missile, Who by Bombing? Israel's Targeted Killings Will Continue." And you started off that article by saying the following, and I'm quoting you now. You said, "After a 5-year moratorium, Israel's targeted killings re-emerged in November of last year," so that's November 2019, "when the IDF conducted a missile strike against the Northern Brigade commander of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Baha Abu al-Atta, in Gaza."
Yes.
And you then go on to say that al-Atta had become a ticking time bomb.
Yes.
Which would seem to be the reason that we saw this re-emergence of the targeted killing, that there was some imminent danger. I'd like you to please tell us what the imminent danger was that was posed by this individual, and why the State of Israel decided to pursue a policy, namely a targeted killing, that according to your writing, it had really been trying to move away from or restrain itself from having to carry out for 5 years. What was going on there? And then I'm going to work through a list of some of the people that you've already mentioned, and people an understanding of why they are targeted.
Okay. First of all, you are right, Benjamin. Part of those who were eliminated by Israel during the last 30 years I knew personally. We mentioned before Enchik Yassin and the other guys from Hamas, and we didn't mention the guys from Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, the Islamic Jihad. But in this case, first of all, you are right by saying that there was like a cessation, a break in the Israeli use of this tool of targeted killings. The last one was, as you said before, it was in November 2019 of Baha Abu al-Atta, the commander of the Northern District of Al-Jihad al-Islami. And beforehand, the last, I would say, targeted killings were taking place in the year 2014. The fact that there was like a cessation, a break in the use of targeted killings is out or as a result of criticism, basically from an international arena, more basically from civil rights organizations in the world. And even in Israel, there was a lot of criticism being directed against the IDF and the Israeli military establishment. I would say in this regard, first of all, targeted killings are a very, very important tool in the campaign, in the military campaign, in the military war against terrorism, be it from the Gaza Strip or from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria alike. And these operations are being taken place only in emergent periods of times when there are terrorists before perpetrating or before exercising terrorist activities against Israeli civilians and soldiers alike. And this was exactly the case of Baha Abu al-Atta, the commander of the Northern District of the Islamic Jihad. He was behind many attacks of missiles, rockets taking place before his assassination, not only against Israeli military, I would say, targets, but at the same time against Israeli villages against Israeli towns, cities, not even in the close distance to the border with the Gaza Strip, but far inside the state of Israel. So Israel was obliged to take such a move in order to annihilate one of the main terrorists that used to be behind terrorist activities against the state of Israel, soldiers and civilians alike. And this was the background or the reasons behind the resolution, the decision taken by by Israel. And when I'm speaking, by the way, Benjamin, about these targeted killings, this is not decision taken by only the military command, only the IDF commanders, the chief of staff, etc. But at the same time, I think that each targeted killing is, there are other ranks which are involved in the decision making. And here I'm indicating first and foremost to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. These are the two high-ranked politicians which are behind the approval given to the IDF command and to the Shabak, to the General Security Service, in order to perpetrate the killings, the targeted killings against these terrorists.
And that targeted killing resulted in a massive bombardment of rockets, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
What made it worthwhile? What exactly was it that made the calculus of the people that you've just mentioned, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and so forth, knowing that there will be retaliation, what made them have to move on that particular target?
We knew beforehand, of course, and you are right, Benjamin, that there will be some kind of retaliation from the Al-Jihad al-Islami organization. But at the same time, the need, the necessity, in order to remove from the way one of the main terrorists, one of the main, I would say, commander, who was behind terrorist activities, bombardment, as you say, attacks, missiles, rockets, etc., against Israeli civilians and the soldiers alike, was this guy, Baha Abu al-Ata. We knew beforehand that it won't, I would say, pass without a retaliation. But we were ready, I'm speaking like as the government of Israel, as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, to pay the price, even if for a limited period of time, people will have to go to shelters in order to defend themselves. But we have to do it, to exercise this, I would say, targeted killing against one of the most prominent terrorists operating in the Palestinian side. Here in this respect, again, I must emphasize, it's not a Hamas activist. Hamas is, of course, as you probably know, is in control of Gaza since June 2007. I'm speaking about Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, the Islamic Jihad organization, which is more, I can say, radical or virulent or extreme even than Hamas. And this is the reason behind the decision, this dramatic decision taken by the Israeli government in order to push from the way, to remove from the way one of the biggest terrorists operating in the Gaza Strip area.
So you've established a little bit about what saw the resurgence of it, and you talked at the beginning of the conversation, David, about the elimination of this fellow, Sheikh Yassin.
Yes.
Now, you knew this individual, and you've described him in lectures to our students when we brought them to Israel.
Yes, yes.
In the same vein here, as a brilliant, brilliant mind. What made this individual such a brilliant mind, and how was it that he won your respect in that sense? Where did you see that manifested?
Yes, I'll tell you frankly. Listen, we are talking about our enemies, but at the same time, we have to be honest and objective. You know, first of all, I published like a research from Haifa University about his personality of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. You know, I think I'm unique in the Israeli defense establishment to know, I would say personally, for a long period of time, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. I first met him when I came to my military service in Gaza at the beginning of 1986. It was the first time that I saw him after he was released from jail in the midst of 1985. I don't know if you remember our 3 soldiers that were in prison in Lebanon, Chezi Shai and the other 2 ones, Yosef Goff. And for these 3 soldiers that were returned, brought back to Israel, we had to release from jail, from the Israeli jails, more than 1,000, Palestinian terrorists. Among them, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. When I first met him, he didn't give you the impression, the clear, right impression, as you know him afterwards. He's in a wheelchair, as we said before, paralyzed. And as a matter of fact, only after meetings that I made with him, I made the meetings in my office in Gaza and at the same time in his home in Jorat al-Shams, in one of the quarters of Gaza called Sabra Quarter. And I saw during the years the sharp mind, the understanding, the profound, deep understanding of the situation, of the scene, not only, in the Arab side, in the Palestinian arena, but even in the Israeli arena. He used to follow the news, what's going on. And I said to myself, the paradox is so clear between these paralyzed guys on a wheelchair, hardly moving his hands, but the mind was so, I would say, sharp and operational. And this is something, from the beginning, I said to myself, I have to follow this guy and to see what he's doing. Listen, I must tell you in this regard something very much important. He established in the year, it was formally, officially, in 1979, an organization, a movement called Al-Mujamma Al-Islami, the Islamic Center. It got the approval of the Israeli government that period of time. And in my book about the Intifada, the uprising in Gaza, I called it the original sin. This was the original sin which brought, after less than 10 years, for the foundation of Hamas, as I've said before, 5 days after the beginning of the first Intifada. I don't want to say that in 1979, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin thought or planned to establish Hamas 10 years later. But I'm saying that during the 80s, he deepened the roots of Al-Mujamma al-Islami, the Islamic brother. As a matter of fact, Al-Mujamma al-Islami is like an offspring or a branch of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Islamic Brotherhood movement, which was founded in Egypt in 1928, and from Egypt spread all over the Middle East. So I'm not saying that he planned in 1989 the establishment of Hamas 10 years later, but he deepened the roots of the Islamic, I would say, network in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And when the Intifada was erupted in 1987, it was very, I would say, simple for him 5 days after to establish with other, members of Al-Mujamma al-Islami, Hamas.
So I told you before. You're meeting with this individual, and you're doing it over several years. And as you've just described, you've gained a great respect for him, though you do define him as your enemy, as a mortal enemy, but you gain a respect for him. And there's not only a paradox that he was a paraplegic, but also had this incredibly sharp mind.
Yes.
But he was an individual who physically could harm no other individual, and yet was orchestrating the build-up and the murder of innocents. Now, at what point, just explain to everybody here the sheer evil and the terror that this individual, number one, was orchestrating across what timeline? And then I want to ask you another question, which is, you knew this man, and at some point you also know that the decision is being made to eliminate him.
Yes.
What was your mindset there? What is your mindset as you go through a process like that? So start off, just explain to everybody very clearly, having established his background, what
Yes.
was this man orchestrating?
Yes, I'll tell you frankly, first of all, I must tell you something very much important. You know, during my military service, especially in Gaza, I met with many high rank or prominent Palestinian leaders, including those who perpetrated terror acts against Israeli targets. But, you know, on the basis of my duty and out of honor to every human being, and my position was in order to collect and to analyze information about what's going on, I treated them with full honor, and they treated me the same. This is why I can tell you, Benjamin, that until today, I have very close relations with people from various organizations operating in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank or Judea and Samaria alike. Out of this kind of human, personal attitude and relations. And this was my duty, and I think it was a very good way for me to perform, to exercise my duty when I was in the military. At the same time, I must tell you, I didn't for a minute forget that when I'm sitting with Sheikh Yassin, and I sat with him for hundreds of times, as I've told you before, I didn't forget, even for a minute, for a second, that Sheikh Yassin represents the most, I would say, radical, extreme enemies of Israel. Because if you know the ideology of Hamas, you have to know that with Hamas, there is no whatsoever any possibility to come to terms, to come to any compromise with Hamas. That in terms of ideology, the ultimate goal is, of course, the annihilation, the extermination.
And what were the terror activities orchestrated by him? Give us one or two examples, and then I want to come back.
Yes, I'll give you examples, very good ones.
Eliminated.
Listen, I must tell you at the beginning, in the 80s, before the first Intifada, he was not involved in terrorist activities, Sheikh Yassin, only in what is called a da'wah activity, which means strengthening the Islamic belief, the Islamic network, building mosques, etc., entering to civilian association, etc., etc., etc. But the beginning of the Intifada marked a very dramatic change in the attitude of Sheikh Yassin and of Al-Mujamma al-Islami by the foundation, the establishment of Hamas. And the first year, by the way, he was not involved in terrorist activities, Sheikh Yassin. He was only behind all the activities in the framework of the Intifada. I mean, throwing stones, putting barracks, Molotov cocktails from time to time. Only at the beginning of 1989, which is after more than a year from the start of the Intifada, he was deeply involved in terrorist activities. In a way, he did not do it, exercise it, by himself. He gave the instructions, he gave the orders, and more than that, he gave the religious infrastructure, the religious, justification for these kind of acts against Israel. And I would like to mention in this regard two names of Israeli soldiers. At the beginning of '89, the Sheikh Yassin was directly involved in sending the terrorists, the Hamas terrorists, in giving, the religious permission for that, given, the ideological basis for this kind of act. Sasportas and Saadon. I don't know if the names are familiar to you. These were two Israeli soldiers being kidnapped by Hamas members, Hamas activists, and killed in the Israeli territory, not in the Gaza Strip. And only after some years, the Shabak, the General Security Service, had the information and found the bodies of these two Israeli soldiers in Israel of the Green Lines. So Sheikh Yassin was behind giving the orders and giving, all the instructions to Hamas people to perpetrate these terror actions. And, Hamas was established, as I've told you before, the 14th of December, 1987. You know that Yassin, pay attention, Benjamin, it's very much important what I'm going to tell you now, was not arrested close to the establishment of Hamas. I must tell you in this regard, the first wave of arrests of Hamas activists took place only in September 1988. That is to say, almost a year after the beginning of the Intifada. I remember myself in a meeting with Minister of Defense Rabin, and there was like a discussion whether to arrest Yassin in September 1988. I must tell you in this regard that I was the only guy against the arrest at that period of time, because I was afraid that the arrest of Yassin will make a big noise, how to say it?
Cause of retaliation.
Retaliation, and there will be actions against
David, if I can, because there are a couple of other people that I want to get through before the end of this conversation. I also want to deal with some strategic aspects of it. There comes a point, though, where this fear and this concern about retaliation is moved to the side, and ultimately the decision is made to eliminate Sheikh Yassin.
Yes.
What's your involvement in that process, please?
Listen, I cannot enter to discussions and meetings. Mm-hmm. It was in the period of time, by the way, of Shaul Mofaz as Minister of Defense. Mm-hmm. And listen, what I can tell you in this regard, I don't know if you're familiar again with the chain of developments. Sheikh Yassin, as I've told you before, was arrested in May 1989. In the year 1988, I hope I'm not mistaken, there was the failure of the Mossad cell, Mossad unit, to annihilate Khalid Mash'al in Amman, in the Hashemite Kingdom.
Yes, let's deal with that for a moment. That was an attempted assassination, if I'm not mistaken, by syringe, where they were seeking to eliminate him.
Yes.
While a guest of Jordan, and it caused an enormous, it failed, the assassination attempt failed. Yes. And it caused an enormous diplomatic fallout at the time, which ultimately came between Israel and Jordan. It actually resulted in, I believe it was the Prime Minister, was it Netanyahu at the time? Sending an antidote over to Amman to sort of remedy the situation, as I understand. But I just want to give people the context there.
Yes, it was antidotes that being injected to Khalid Mash'al in order to save his life. I don't know if you remember. But at the end of, as a result of this failure by the Mossad people to annihilate, to kill Khalid Mash'al in Amman, you are with me?
Yeah, we're with you. I want to show everybody this is Sheikh Yassin. This is the individual.
This is Sheikh Yassin.
This is somebody, a real wolf in sheep's clothing, who to all intents and purposes looks like an innocent individual, but this man had the blood on his hands of dozens and dozens of innocents.
Exactly, you are right. I mean, at the end, after the failure to assassinate Khalid Mash'al in Amman, Israel was obliged, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was obliged to release Sheikh Ahmed Yassin from jail. And after a tour he made, like a triumph tour, a victory tour, in some Arab countries and in Iran as well, he came back to Gaza, and he came back to lead Hamas activities again, and Hamas operations, terrorist operations against the Israeli targets. So there was no other choice but to take the decision which brought at the end to the annihilation, to the killing of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin at the 22nd of March 2004.
So we make the decision in Israel and we carry out the decision there to eliminate that individual. And this is where you come into the strategic aspect of targeted killings, David, because right after him, there comes to the fore this fellow Rantisi.
Yes.
Right. So Yassin, Sheikh Yassin is eliminated. He's killed in his wheelchair. There's footage all over the place of his wheelchair after the detonation. And there's another paradox, David, that comes about because the leader that rises to that position is this fellow Rantisi. And Rantisi, of all things, while being a terrorist and an orchestrator of terror, and the individual who inherited the reins of the terror organization, also happens to be a pediatrician.
Yes.
Right? So this is a man who studied medicine, who's a practicing pediatrician, and he's also somebody who you knew. You say in your article on the Miriam Institute website, you say, I knew Rantisi well from my military service in Gaza. Quote, it was impossible to miss his burning hatred of Israel and Jews. Each time we would meet, I could feel his hateful gaze upon me. Rantisi was also a founding member of Hamas, and he was one of the 415 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists deported to Lebanon in December 1992 by the Rabin government. Now,
exactly.
That's very, very interesting, and I know that you could speak about it at length. But what I want to understand is this. What was the decision process behind the more or less immediate elimination of Rantisi afterwards? Because whereas Israel equivocated or hesitated a little bit to target Yassin, and you've spoken about your personal objections to doing so because you feared a backlash, there wasn't that hesitation when it came to eliminating Rantisi more or less right after. Why not, David?
I'll tell you frankly again, you are right. I knew...
David, I have to be right because it's your article.
Yes. You know, I must tell you, I knew Rantisi even before the beginning of the first Intifada. And each time I met him, you were right by saying, I felt like arrows of fires are attacking me by his eyes, only by his eyes. I saw the hatred. I saw the animosity. I saw the extreme, attitude against, the negative attitude against Israel, against the Jewish people. And this was so vividly, done or exercised by Rantisi. And he was, as you have said before, a medical doctor. He studied in Egypt. He came back, and he was from the beginning one of the main activists of Al-Mujamma al-Islami, of this organization prior to the establishment of Hamas. And he was among those who were with Yassin, operating with Yassin during the 80s. I must tell you in this regard that his fame, the origins of his fame in the Palestinian arena came after he was deported with the 415 activists of Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami to southern Lebanon. The name of the place, by the way, is Marj al-Zuhur, the Valley of Flowers, a name which is so in contrast to the people that it hosted. In any case, when he was in Marj al-Zuhur, when he was in southern Lebanon, he became like the leader of the people that was deported. And afterwards, when he came back to Gaza, he, as a matter of fact, returned with his, I would say, activities, operations against Israel. And there was no other choice. After the killing of Yassin in the 22nd of March, in the 17th of April 2004, Israel was obliged to take the other decision to annihilate, to kill Abdelaziz al-Rantisi.
Why, David? Why was
Because he led Hamas after Sheikh Yassin, and not only in this period of time of more than 3 weeks, but what happened before. He was behind terrorist activities against Israeli targets, and there was no other choice on behalf of the Israeli government but to annihilate, to kill Abdelaziz Rantisi after, as I said before, Yassin was killed.
Were you involved in that process, David?
I was involved in many processes, but I don't want to enter in deep.
I just want people to understand you're an individual who is involved not only in meeting and speaking and coordinating with these people and sometimes negotiating, but you're also involved in the process whereby these people are removed from the face of the earth. Is that correct?
You can say so. I don't want to elaborate.
That's all. I won't push you.
You can say so. This is a diplomatic answer, I know. But I don't want to enter deeply to this kind of...
And I won't ask you to enter deeply, and I don't want you to discuss anything that you can't discuss. But I do want people to understand that from my perspective, from Rosita's perspective, they have the opportunity today to hear and to interact with a hero in you. And I want you to understand that's why I'm asking. And,
yeah.
and I
Benjamin, please, first of all, don't exaggerate.
No, I knew you were going to say that. But I know
I feel today that I did my duty. I did my job. I fulfilled my mission.
And I want to continue about that.
I'll tell you frankly, I think the most important period of time in my life, and maybe I'm using, high words, high terms. I mean, the most important period of my time as an Israeli patriot, was during the period of time, these 30 years in the army, in the military. Because afterwards, I was in the Ministry of Defense as an advisor to, as you said before, to various ministers of defense. But I think the most important period of time in terms of having an influence on the decision-making, I mean, from the military point of view, was during my military service, the 30 years of my military service in the IDF.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I want to ask one more question about Hamas, and then I'm going to pivot to another subject. And I just want to remind the audience that we aim to have this call conclude at 1:15 p.m. But as I knew you would be able to speak about any of these subjects in such a detailed fashion, and I hope you'll come back on with us. But I want to quote something else again in the same article that's on our website about targeted killings. And I would encourage people to go onto the site and to read David Hacham's article on this matter. You write, quote, that there can be no dispute that targeted killings form one of the most critical and important methods Israel has in its long-term war against terrorism.
Yes.
Targeted killings stir fear among those terrorists seeking to do harm. Their use pushes terror organizations into defensive positions. Now, that's a very strong statement, but you go on to conclude with this sentence. You say, after the initial shock, new operatives rise up and fill the ranks.
Yes.
And the very real threat of their removal, as was the case with Rantisi, who succeeded Sheikh Yassin, looms large. Now, with all of that having been said, do you feel that targeted killings have pushed Hamas into a defensive crouch? And also, do you feel that that defensive crouch is one that expires after a certain period of time?
Yes. First of all, you are right. I think the targeted killings are one of the main, I would say, tools used by the Israeli Defense Forces in order to fight against terrorism. But this tool was like taken place, was exercised only when we are speaking about like ticking bombs in the Palestinian side. It's not something which is all the way being done by the IDF. It's only when we are speaking about a real close danger to Israeli lives, soldiers and civilians alike. And this is why, until today, I'm speaking from the even 1948, up until today, the numbers of targeted killings are not more than 100. But including them, there was the main terrorists operating in the Palestinian side. We didn't mention other names, but there are more names that I think you should know. And it was very careful used by the State of Israel. Only when we are speaking about ticking bombs in the Palestinian side, a decision was taken in order to eliminate and to kill these people. Now, you are right. The influence of the targeted killings on the Palestinian various organizations is not, for years. We are not speaking about a long, long period of time of influence. But for the time being, for a couple of months, half a year, there is a very, very prominent influence on the activities of the Palestinian terrorist organization. Afterwards, they are reviving. They are like exercising again terror acts against Israel. But Israel cannot, I would say, abandon the use of targeted killings as a mean, as a tool in order to press upon the Palestinian terrorists and to prevent and frustrate the exercise of terrorist activities against Israeli targets.
So I've got three main questions that I'd like to zone in on. The first one is, I don't know whether you have any insights into this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yes, please.
You were getting right in the article that another senior terror figure who was eliminated from the scene through a targeted operation was Fatih al-Shkaki, a founder and first operational head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, this is the interesting thing about this to me, David. He was killed in Malta, you go on to say, on October 26, 1995, in a special Mossad operation. Again, you say, I knew Shkaki very well. He studied medicine in Egypt, where he was first exposed to the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. So aside from the fact that this is yet another doctor with murderous intentions towards the people of Israel, or a would-be doctor, I have a question for you. What is the role of the academic scene in these countries, such as Egypt, when it comes to recruiting and fanaticizing individuals during the course of their studies? How active are these universities in this type of recruitment? Do you know anything about that? Is that a field you can shed some light on?
Listen, I don't want to say that I'm an expert in this field, but many of the Palestinian terrorists or high-ranked terrorists, leaders in the terrorist organizations, first of all, they studied in universities, and some of them studied medicine, medical studies. Basically, I'm speaking about Egypt. You mentioned beforehand not only Dr. Fatih Shkaki, but Dr. Rantisi. He was a doctor.
Exactly.
I'll tell you more than that. Even another guy that you didn't mention, Mahmoud al-Zahar, was a doctor. They didn't practice for a long period of time their profession. But at the same time, I must tell you another thing which is related to your question. When I came to Gaza, I was really shocked and surprised that many in the Palestinian movements, terrorist movement organizations, are academics, are people, Palestinians that completed their university studies, academic studies, not only doctors, medical doctors, but other academic people, many of them. And this was like shocking news, very much impressive to know that in the leadership of these organizations, we are speaking about very educated people. And as you have said before, Rantisi and Shkaki are only an example for what I'm telling you.
Are these universities a recruiting ground for would-be terrorists? Is that an integral part of the terror activities to go to these campuses to make the appropriate outreach and to recruit, frankly, based on your idea of respecting your enemy, the best and the brightest in order to orchestrate these terror activities? Is that part of what we see in the Middle East?
I think that you are perfectly right in this regard. And don't forget another very important fact that I'm going to tell you now. You know that one of the main, I would say, sources for mobilizing people, activists to Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami is the universities. And when I'm speaking about universities, please take into consideration one university, one academic institution, and this is the Islamic University, Al-Jamia Al-Islamiyya in Gaza. It was established in the beginning of the 80s, 81, I think. And after like a couple of years, Hamas, or Al-Mujama Al-Islami, the organization before Hamas, took control of the university. And many of the students in this university became like an activist in Hamas organization. And this is one of the main facts. By the way, until today, this university, Al-Jamia Al-Islamiyya, the Islamic University, is the main source for recruiting people for the service of the activities of Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank. In the West Bank, there are other universities as well, Islamic universities. But this is, I would say, the main institution.
I just want to emphasize your view that in Judea and Samaria, in the universities there are also great efforts afoot to recruit terrorists while they are in their academic studies. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, you're right.
Would you, this wasn't one of my original three questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Would you be surprised if you were to find out that in Western universities, there is also a great deal of Islamic money that is dedicated to finding and uncovering individuals with malign or even murderous intentions towards the state of Israel? Can you speak to that?
Yes. Listen, Benjamin, it's very clear-cut what you the answer to your question.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, I don't want to enter into details about this issue, but it's not only in the last couple of years. Even during the Intifada, the first Intifada period of time, there was a flow of money, of assistance, financial assistance given from the United States of America to the activities of Hamas in the territories. I would like to mention in this regard one name that you probably know, Musa Abu Marzouk, which is one of the main activists today in Hamas. He came during the first Intifada from the United States in order to bring money for the sake of the activities of Hamas in the Gaza Strip area. And this is one of the main, I would say, channel of providing, of financing the activities of Hamas, Al-Jihad al-Islami, etc. And as we know, and you probably know, in America, in many universities, academic institutions, the Islamic group, the Islamic movement is very much active in recruiting people, in mobilizing the people, in recruiting money for the sake of Hamas.
Right. And I want to get a direct answer from you, and I realize why you won't go into too many details, but I want a direct answer. A lot of people, when they see the recruitment to Islamic movements on university campuses, think this is like the recruitment to Jewish cultural events, like a Bet Hillel or a Chabad or so on and so forth. That's not always the case. There is recruitment to Islamic and Islamist movements on campuses that can have repercussions by way of the terror activities against and the murder of Jews and citizens in the state of Israel. Is that correct?
Exactly. You are perfectly right. First of all, don't make this comparison.
Exactly.
It's out of question. Because when we are speaking about the Zionist activities in America, for instance, we are speaking about activities in order to promote welfare, to promote the civilian life, the standard of living in Israel for the citizens. When we are speaking about Islamic, radical Islamic activities in the campuses, in the universities in the United States, and elsewhere, by the way.
Where elsewhere?
Britain,
Tell us, where elsewhere? We know about
Great
the
Britain, Great
Mhm.
Britain. I'm
Go on.
speaking about Great Britain. I
Mhm.
mean, it's something which is very much known now. You don't need to give evidence for what I'm saying, to give proofs. I mean, these are organizations, or these Islamic, I would say, activities, is in order to strengthen the terrorist abilities, capabilities of Hamas, of Al-Jihad al-Islami, in order to perpetrate terrorist acts against Israeli civilians, soldiers, etc. So there is a big, big difference between, the Zionist Israeli activities and the Palestinian terrorist Islamic activities.
Absolutely. And because the people on this call and the people who, more importantly, in terms of the numbers, when I say more importantly, will hear this from probably the United States of America, is it fair to say that the Islamic activities that take place on campuses in the Western world potentially can result in the deaths of Israeli citizens?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. And that's
correct. I mean, listen, it's not, I would say, like a direct
right.
seen influence. But when we are speaking about what is going on in the campuses in the United States, in Western Europe, there is like, I would say, a linkage between what's going on in the campuses and academic institutions in terms of these radical Islamic activities and radical Muslims operating there, and the terrorist activities being perpetrated in the West Bank and Gaza alike.
David, one more question on this subject, if I may, and then I'm going to ask the last two subjects that I mentioned to you, and I'm afraid I'm being mindful of the time. But without you compromising anything that you wish to keep to yourself, do you happen to have the name of a given terrorist, for example, with whom you have had to deal through your various positions in the IDF and also in the Ministry of Defense, who was educated specifically in a Western university and was perhaps radicalized during that time? Is there anybody that comes to mind?
Listen, I met many Palestinians who studied in universities in the West, in America or in Europe, West Europe. But I don't recall right now a Palestinian Islamic activist that studied in America or Europe. I mean, most of those who were like active in Palestinian Islamic organizations, they were studied in Egypt, in universities in Egypt. I mentioned before Fatah Shkaki, Rantisi, etc., that were, they were studied in university in Egypt. Not, but for sure there are, listen, I think, no, he's Egyptian. I thought about the Egyptian president, the late Egyptian president.
Well, I'm going to speak to
Morsi, Mohammed Morsi.
Maybe we can send some names out to the people who are following this afterwards. Even though you don't have the name to hand, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to find that. Now, I want to move on to something else quickly, and then I'll finish with a quick question. You speak about the engineer.
Yes.
And this is the most unbelievable story of targeted killings. You say an additional prominent figure targeted by Israel for assassination was Yahya Ayash, also known as the engineer. Yahya's killing occurred on January 5th, 1996, through a booby-trapped cell phone in which 50 grams of explosives had been planted. Why was that man taken out, and what went into that operation?
Say it again, please. I didn't hear you.
Why was that individual eliminated, and what went into that operation?
Listen, the engineer is very much known. This is not, a hidden story. Originally, he's from the West Bank, and he found refuge and shelter in the area of Bet Lahia, which is like a town in the northern part of the Gaza Strip area. He was called the engineer because he was very qualitative in dealing with explosives, explosive material. By the way, I can tell you something. I was not behind, of course, the plan and the initiation to kill the engineer. It was basically the mission of Shabak and of Avi Dichter, which was later on the head of the Shabak, the head of the General Security Service. In any case, I must tell you in this regard, again, he found refuge in the Gaza Strip. The Shabak and the IDF was behind him while he was in the West Bank. And when he came to Gaza and lived in the area of Bet Lahia, there was intelligence information coming to the IDF and the General Security Service. And this led at the end for this most sophisticated and wise operation you ever hear about. To give a cell phone, listen carefully, Benjamin. The cell phone was given, not directly to Yahya Ayyash. It was given to a Shabak, to a General Security Service agent. And he gave the telephone, he gave the cellular phone to one of his family, a member of his family that lived in Bet Lahia, and he, in his turn, gave this cellular phone to Yahya Ayyash. It was inevitable. It was a must, the annihilation of Yahya Ayyash. He was behind many, many, many terrorist operations brought to the killings of many Israeli civilians, many terrorist activities taking place by Ayyash. He was behind the preparing of the explosives because he was like an expert in explosives. And at the end of the day, there was no other choice by the Israeli side, by the Israeli, IDF commanders and the political level to take this decision to annihilate Yahya Ayyash. It was, by the way, as you have said before, it's very important now, at the 5th of January, 1996. And listen carefully, it was 2 weeks, 2 weeks before the first elections taking place for the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo process. It was in the 20th of January, 1996, the first elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council, for the Palestinian Parliament in the Oslo process. It sounds today like, dreams or, something not real. But this was the period of time in January 1996.
David, one of the things that you've written about again in your article is the idea of the international community registering its outrage with the state of Israel for its practice of targeted killings. And yes, right at the beginning of your article, I just want to go back to that original quote. You said, after a 5-year moratorium, Israel's targeted killings re-emerged in November of 2019. And you've explained to us that that 5-year moratorium is in part because of the international outrage about the problems, about the policy rather. So let me just ask you a basic question.
Yes.
All of that international outrage about targeted killings and everything that you've explained as to the exceptional circumstances under which targeted killings take place, a ticking time bomb, an imminent threat, a clear and present danger, whatever it may be. Do you happen to have the name of any other country that might employ the tactic of targeted killings? Can you name any other countries that do that?
You want me to say in accordance with my information?
Yeah, are there other countries in the world that are engaged in the practice of targeted?
Yes.
Name 3, 4, 5
One country that you are speaking from.
Could you name names of countries that are engaged?
The annihilation in Iraq of this head of the Al-Quds, organization, Iranian.
So America correctly, in our view, took out Soleimani.
Soleimani, yes.
Any other countries? Does Britain do this? Does France do this? Does Germany do this?
Listen, there is a big differences between Israel and the countries that you've mentioned. We are living in a very tough area, surrounded by enemies, by countries, by movements, terrorist organization who would like to see at the end of the day the extermination, annihilation of the state of Israel. So this comparison is out, of course, of question. There is no place for this kind of comparison between Israel and Western democracies. But when you are in danger, when your life, the life of your civilians, the lives of your soldiers are at stake, I mean, any country in the world must take all the necessary actions, activities, acts in order to frustrate and to bring about the end of these terrorists, which are, they have the ambition to perpetrate terrorist acts against the Israeli side. I'm saying this, and this is a fact of life. As I've told you before, from 1948, many, targeted killings have been, perpetrated by Israel. But it was in cases in which it was a must to perpetrate this kind of act. I know all the criticism from the international community, from human rights organizations in the world, etc., etc. But when it comes for the sake of Israeli citizens, I mean, any country in the world would take these kind of decisions in order to save and to keep the lives of innocent Israelis.
Well,
And
David,
this is the case in this regard.
David, I want to thank you because we're very much coming to the end of our time for this call. I just want to say a couple of things that I hope that everyone listening to you is aware of the fact that you're somebody who's been involved in the targeting of some of the individuals that we mentioned today and others who we haven't mentioned today. But you've done so with the specific goal that you just alluded to in your final response there of removing one individual with a view to preserving the lives of dozens, hundreds, even thousands of individuals. And you've done that as a Jew. You've done that as an individual who's given the best of his service, his professional service to the state of Israel and the people of Israel and the story of Israel. And you're also somebody who's always willing to speak on it. You do not speak ill of Israel's enemies, but you do speak with pride and with confidence in the righteousness of that which you were instrumental in bringing about and were engaged in bringing to fruition. And you don't just do that here on a webinar, but you also speak to our groups when we bring them to Israel. You've spoken to delegations of our graduate students and also military cadets from 15 different countries from around the world in terms of the grad students, and also to the military cadets from the US, from the Air Force, and from West Point Military Academy. And it's so important that future leaders, such as the grad students, and indeed future officers and leaders, such as the cadets, who are going to serve and place themselves in the line of fire, understand the nature of the enemy that Israel is facing, which is an enemy in many cases that is common to Americans and to American commanders and officers and operators. And when I listen to you, David, and I say this on behalf of Rosita and our organization entire and everybody who's listening either live or in the postcast, I realize that I'm listening to an individual who can only grow, who can only flourish, who can only develop, and who can only be deployed with such effectiveness and efficiency within the state of Israel. An individual like you, an individual who is a Jewish individual who is informed by Jewish principles and who then deploys those to the physical, life-saving defense of the Jewish state, only grows in the state of Israel. And I really do mean that. I think that you're the absolute manifestation of that which occurs when a people is reconciled with its land and when a land is reconciled with its people. Something very, very unique grows out of that. circumstance. And I just want to thank you so very much for your time. We look forward to bringing you to lecture in the United States and elsewhere when the world comes to rights again. And of course, it will come to rights ultimately. I want to give you one last word. You're the author of a book that's recently been published. Can you just tell us the name of that book, please, if you would? Just one of them. I know you have several, but you...
Yeah, the first research was about Sheikh Yassin. It was published by Haifa University. And the book about the Intifada in Gaza is called Gaza in the Storm, or something like this.
Eye of the Storm. It's Gaza.
The Eye of the Storm, the inside story of the Intifada. And it gives you the whole process of the Intifada, not only from the beginning, but what were the roots, the reasons behind the eruption of the Intifada in the 9th of December until the beginning, the start of the Oslo process. And many of the names that we didn't mention now appeared in this book. I mean, beside all the known names that we spoke about.
David, we'll be sure to bring you to lecture, and we'll be sure to take you to the campuses. And I can tell you the takeaway that I would primarily want people to have from this call is what goes on campuses globally has an impact upon the safety, security, and even lives of Israelis. And we have to watch that with a very well-trained, focused eye indeed. So thank you so very much on behalf of me, on behalf of Rosita, on behalf of the Miriam Institute. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to all of our guests today. And I look forward to us reconvening in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you, Benjamin, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for your kind
words. It's a big heart, and it's a heart that beats for the...
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.